Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, A Century of Struggle, Women's Movements and Rights in Turkey, organized by the UP Diliman Asian Center. I am Mark Isla of Far Eastern University, your moderator for this online event. This webinar was made possible in partnership with the Philippine Middle East Studies Association, Mindanao State University Main Campus, and Mindanao State University General Santos City. To welcome our guests and participants in tonight's webinar, we'd like to invite Dr. Henelito Sevilla Jr., the Dean of UP Diliman Asian Center and President of Philippine Middle East Studies Association.
Thank you very much, Professor Isla. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everyone. It is my honor to welcome you all to another webinar organized by the UP Asian Center, the Philippine Middle East Studies Association and their partners, the Mindanao State University General Santos and the Department of International Relations of Mindanao State University, MSU, Marawi City. Asian Center prides itself as one, if not the only academic institution in the country that offers an Asian Studies graduate program with West Asia as an area of specialization. As such, we have taken on an important role in promoting greater understanding of the region and its unique political, economic, social, and cultural systems. Tonight, we shine a light on Turkey and, in particular, how the women questions play out in this modern Islamic country. For this, we are fortunate to have with us our distinguished speaker, Dr. Zehra Arat, Professor of Political Science at the University of Connecticut, who will share with us her decades of research on women's struggle in Turkey. In particular, Dr. Arat's talk will focus on the development of the women's movement throughout the century and how women have had to contend with and contest conservative forces in the country. The women movements in Turkey have been instrumental in creating free political, socio-economic, and legal spaces for women. From the decline of the Ottoman Empire and towards the creation of modern Turkey in 1920s, women had to assert their rights to free education, fair salary, and equal representation. They have had to struggle against gender-based discrimination at home, in the workplace, and in the public spaces. In their struggles, they have also contributed to the advance of equal rights and opportunities for marginalized groups and sectors. Among their gains was the Tanzimat reforms, which was integral to the country's modernization efforts. The equality legislation in 1923 opened the door for several women to assume high political and judicial positions. More recent victories include the election of the first woman prime minister in 1993 and the appointment of a woman as president of the Turkish Constitutional Court. Given such gains, it has been argued that Turkish women enjoyed many rights that women in the Greater Middle East and North African region did not have. Yet, the women's movement has suffered a setback under the conservative Erdogan's government. In March of 2021, the government announced its withdrawal from the Council of Europe Convention on the Prevention of Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. Ironically, in 2012, Turkey was the first country to ratify the convention, which was the product of the 2011 international conference that was held in Istanbul. Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention is a cause of concern. One study in 2018, for instance, found that in 2019, about 42% of Turkish women between the ages of 15 and 60 experienced some form of physical and sexual abuses from their husbands and or their partners. Today, the country is seeing the rise of femicide due to domestic violence and honor killings. Current trends would lead us to ask these questions. One, is the preservation of family values as advanced by Erdogan government the real reason behind the withdrawal from Istanbul Convention? Is the withdrawal from Istanbul Convention a signal to a return to Islamic conservatism or a way of diverting public opinion from economic crisis Turkey is currently experiencing? Third, what are the implications of this move to women's rights and women's movement in Turkey? Tonight's talk will undoubtedly shed light to the work ahead for the Turkish women's movement. And in behalf of the Asian Center, UP or University of the Philippines, Diliman, the Philippine Middle East Studies Association, their partner universities, the Department of International Relations of Mindanao State University, Marawi campus, and the Graduate School of Mindanao State University, General Santos, I would like to welcome Dr. Zehra Kabasakal Arat to this symposium. Maraming salamat at magandang gabi sa ating lahat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sevilla, for the welcoming remarks. Now, in tonight's webinar, our guest speaker will examine the struggle of women of Turkey for their rights since the early 20th century, offering a corrective to the argument that women in Turkey were granted rights without a struggle. The lecture will examine waves of women's movements, their demands, achievements, and challenges, including women's current struggle against the conservative gender policies for the increasingly authoritarian rule. Our guest speaker studies human rights with emphasis on women's rights as well as processes of democratization, globalization, and development. She combines theoretical writings with empirical research. Her publications include numerous journal articles and book chapters, as well as books such as Democracy and Human Rights in Developing Countries, Deconstructing Images of the Turkish Woman, Non-State Actors in the Human Rights Universe, Human Rights Worldwide, and Human Rights in Turkey. She received the Choice Award of Outstanding Academic Titles for the uses and misuses of human rights. She has served in various professional organizations in different capacities. She is the founding president of Human Rights Section of the American Political Science Association and Chair, Human Rights Research Committee of the International Political Science Association. Currently, she serves on the editorial boards of American Political Science Review, Human Rights Quarterly, International Feminist Journal of Politics, among others. Her work in progress includes human rights discourse and practices in Turkey, women's rights and empowerment, human rights norms and relationship between human rights and scholars and NGOs, as well as theorizing domestic politics of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome Dr. Zehra Kabasakal Arat.
Well, thank you for the kind words and for inviting me. Starting with Professor Sevilla, I would like to thank everybody who was involved in organizing and realizing this event. I am absolutely delighted to join you today in Manila, that it's in virtually. And of course, it would be wonderful to do this in person. I guess today I have to do such a good job, then you may invite me back in person after the pandemic. So we'll see. Before I start my talk, I would like to congratulate you all for your recent Nobel Prize. And I think Marisa Risa's achievement is an achievement for the entire country, particularly for the Filipino women. So congratulations. Now let me turn to my screen. Can you see the PowerPoints?
Yes.
Yes, it's
okay.
You can see it.
Wonderful. I'll try to get the laser pointer. Okay. Well, today, actually, we are going to visit more than a century, more than 100 years, more like 120 years of Turkish and late Ottoman history to examine women's movements and rights. I will try to bring in a historical overview, although Dr. Sevilla already did that to a great extent. So I'll try to cut down the repetition. And I will also throw in a little bit of my own personal experience and engagement. Before I was a human rights scholar, I was actually a human rights activist. So hopefully that will give us a certain perspective. Women, I have four main points I would like to make here in this talk. Well, first is, as already stated by Professor Sevilla, women gained significant rights in different periods. And I will contend that these gains were due to basically women's mobilization and struggle, and introduced this corrective, that the common assumption that women were granted rights without engagement. And so my corrective is that they did win their rights. And then male endorsement was there, that's true, but I will contend that it was rather reluctant, or the instrumentalists, that basically they supported women's rights as a means towards some other goal. And progress has not been linear and also subject to reversals. And I would also add here, just like even when we had progress, there were some limitations always. I will examine this over 100 years of women's struggle in 4 periods. 2 of these periods would be considered legitimately reform periods. The first from the beginning of the 20th century through the 1930s. And we see during this period actually the first women's movement and first wave of women's movement in Turkey. And then we had as a second period would be what I would call, with regret, dormant years, where women's activism was there, but within mostly left-wing politics, and women's rights were subdued, maybe we can say. And the third period would be another reform period starting in the mid-1980s through the first decade of the new millennium. And during this period, we see the second wave of women's movement. And so the reforms were achieved. Then the fourth period, roughly speaking, since 2012, it is hard to put a date, but that I call the period of backlash and reversals, and which pushed the women's movement to resist deterioration. But ironically, this is also the period that increased women's activism, feminist activism in particular. Well, the first period is associated with this person, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who is considered to be the father of the modern nation, the Republican Turkey. And he and his colleagues actually launched a period of reforms, and the reforms of modernization, which we may also call westernization in certain ways, called Kemalism, Kemalist reforms after his name, in fact. Now, there were some significant actually gains during this reform period by women. The constitution, the first constitution of the country, recognized primary or stated primary education to be mandatory and free for both sexes. And also the policies involved providing free education, again, for both sexes at all levels, not mandatory, but only primary education was mandatory. And the government established more schools for girls and also pursued gradually co-education. And a landmark was the civil rights, civil law legislation of 1926. This was a significant move because it ended polygyny, child marriage, and men's right to unilateral divorce by simply repeating your divorce 3 times, and that would be the end of the marriage, and also gave women the right to initiate divorce. And it also established equality in inheritance rights, as well as women and men serving as witnesses. And in many ways, what we can say that civil law was a secularization attempt in many ways. And in 1930s, political rights, women achieved their political rights, first in the right to run for office and vote in municipal elections in 1934 in national elections. And culturally, an important move was the not by force, but through by some example setting and modeling to the desegregation of sexes and creating opportunities for women to be present in public sphere and participate in public life. And another one was outfit reform, which had some mixed consequences. We may say that Western clothing, both for men and women, was adopted. Now, as a consequence of the granting this women's political rights, in the first national elections, 17 women were nominated and acquired seats in the parliament. And for a long time, actually, this was a record number, and it was not exceeded until the last decade or so. Now, here is a corrective that we are, I was like, as a Turkish citizen, I'm a Turkish American, live in the United States, but was born and raised in Turkey. Turkish citizens, we believe that these rights were granted by the modernizing male elite. And women did not even ask for them almost. Well, contrary to that, actually, at the turn of the century, in the early 20th century, in the Ottoman Empire, there was a viable women's movement, mostly in the main cities, major cities, mostly led or involved upper class or upper middle class women. But women of different faith and ethnicities were involved, often collaborated, and they had an agenda, and they wanted education, access to education, they wanted access to employment, and they also wanted the family life to be reformed. They were against polygyny, they wanted to have nuclear family. And they were successful both in the Ottoman era. There was a civil law, new civil law enacted there, but actually it was their agenda that was put into practice in the Republican era. Now, the Ottoman women were not, or the same women actually continued in the Republican era. In the Ottoman period, they didn't ask for political rights, yet they said that not for now, we'll come to that in time. And after the establishment of the Republic, they did demand political rights. And they, in fact, before they got the right to vote and so would nominate candidates for the parliament, and they would, some of them would be men, and they would also nominate women. And of course, they were not consequential, but they asserted their voice. They also established a women's party, a political party. Now, let's say that again, this like the reforms in terms of their impact, while they were rather extensive reforms, they also had limitations, and one category of limitations, we would say that laws maintained inequalities. And civil law, for example, recognized husband, the head of the family, and as provider, assigned women the responsibility of caring for the house, women's employment would depend on the husband's permission, employment outside home. And in the penal code, sex offenses are treated as offenses against society, not against a person. And adultery is also defined as a public offense. And more importantly, penalty for adultery and rape would vary according to the status of women, if they were married, unmarried, or sex workers. And in case of rape, the charges could be dropped if the victim's family agreed that to the fact that the rapist married the victim. So this was a awful situation, created awful situation that women, and sometimes we would say girls actually, would be condemned to living with their rapists for their entire life. Another limitation was the egalitarian provisions of the law and policies were not fully implemented. And in terms of the political elite discourse, there were mixed messages regarding women's place. On the one hand, women's primary place is defined as home, and motherhood was emphasized as the women's main responsibility. But on the other hand, the women were invited to participate in the public life, but that participation was also not completely set free. Then some behavioral codes had to be followed, and male control was asserted in many ways. And with these, it is like you can say that women's dependency on husband and financially and in many ways, and the also traditional gender norms were actually reinforced despite, again, some changes. So while significant opportunities were created for women, we cannot underestimate that. Because of these limitations, the gender gap in all areas remained. Now, I call this instrumentalism. The women were granted some rights, not with the purpose of establishing gender equality, but for economic development and westernization of the country. Women would become these modern symbols of a modern Turkey as modern women. Now, there is another important part of the history regarding women's movement we have to acknowledge here. The women's groups and organizations struggled for these rights, and they gained them. But then some of these organizations were dissolved, and one prominent one, Women's Union, which emphasized political rights of women in particular. Once the political rights were achieved, say that our task is complete, and it dissolved itself. And others were co-opted by the political system, and those who remained as critical of the system continued with demands. So people like Zehra Muhyiddin were alienated and silenced. And that took us to the second period in the late 1930s and continued till about mid-1980s, what I call dormant, because there was really no viable women's organizations and movements anymore. And in this period, in the 1940s, the country moved from one-party rule to multi-party rule. which revived party politics, and a new constitution adopted in 1961 expanded the freedoms and created opportunities for an increased civic engagement and civil society activism. Well, women participated in these organizations, but not to demand women's rights, but engaged mostly in left-wing politics, and their gender-based advocacy would focus on basically the advocacy of the working class women's rights. And so class politics subdued the gender politics, we may say. So main achievement during this period was, there was only one, I would say, and that was the ratification of the ILO Convention for Equal Pay for Equal Work. And it was ratified by Turkey in 1967. And I have to say that it was not implemented, and not implemented even now. Now, the third period, it comes actually this period, I call it a reform period, mainly from women's perspective. And it also involves some other reforms, and especially in the later years of this period. But I would like to say that this period is quite mixed. It comes with repression, persecutions, and so on, as well as expansion of freedoms and legislative reforms. Now, in 1980, at the end of the 1980, there was a military coup, most brutal of all, and military government ruled for 3 years before country returned to the civilian rule. And military government imposed political bans and pursued a deliberate depoliticization agenda, and repressed particularly the left-wing political groups and organizations. Now, this is a rather ironic outcome. It is the kind of like we may call fortune over misfortune, that it allowed women who were originally engaged in left-wing politics to establish their independent women's organizations. And then later on, other groups joined in. So, but we can say that starting in mid-1980s, a women's movement started to unfold in Turkey. And this time, women, no matter what ideological perspective they had, actually to great extent focused on gender subjugation and targeted discrimination in laws and discrimination practice for change. And they emphasized particularly violence against women as an issue. And you see a picture of a demonstration, and I would like to highlight one campaign they had. It was called Purple Needle campaign. Purple is the color of battering and wounds in Turkey. Black and blue in English is actually purple in Turkish. So they had these needles, big needles with a purple ribbon at the end. It is distributed on the streets against the sexual harassment women experience on the street, in public transportation, and so on. So women were told to use these needles against the perpetrator. They also emphasized self-education and feminist awareness and consciousness. They organized street protests, involved in publishing and debating against feminist goals. They also established organizations that would provide service to women who were not able to get service from the government. These could be from some meeting directly their needs to legal advice and so on. During this period, also women are engaged in politics, mostly by lobbying political parties and government, and collaborating with them to have in the institution building process, such as creating gender equality and women's rights agencies within the state bureaucracy. Women worked as consultants, and also later on, they also took part in these agencies. Ideological spectrum was broad. There was socialist feminists, mostly engaged in publication of journals, feminist journals, and debating, again, different forms of feminism. And they created in Istanbul, a feminist cafe with a feminist bookstore attached to that. Amargi, it was the journal of this particular group. They emphasized the class issues and the economic structural problems in addressing women's concerns. And there was Kurdish women, whose reality and experience was quite different. Since the starting in the early 1980s, the Kurdish nationalist movement established a political political party and militia called Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK in Kurdish acronym, and launched actually an armed struggle against Turkish military. And it's important to underline it was against the military. But nevertheless, women were in mainly Kurdish populated provinces in Southeast were in crossfire, and they not only they were subject to state repression as for being Kurdish, but also lived in war zones, and so they had to endure all kinds of hardship that comes with militarism and warfare. And there was religious and part of it we may call Islamist women. They were mostly mobilized against the ban imposed by the military government and carried out, continued by the civilian governments, ban on headscarves in universities and in government offices. So they would protest and press for that need, that change. And here it is important to note that Islamist men supported or maybe even mobilized women for this. They refer to this as a struggle for religion, freedom of religion. Women embraced it, but they also put in that or framed this struggle as women's right to education and employment. And some controversies among the group emerged about the, again, the commercialization of this attire, this particular attire, and the conservative takeover of this movement and so on. That is in a way that the movement itself was not uniform. And there was the LGBT plus groups. In 1990s, they started to establish their own organizations, and LGBT plus movement actually found some support among some feminists, especially socialist feminists, and many of the lesbian and trans women were actually involved in socialist groups as well, prior to they established, again, LGBT organizations. Now, within this diversity of various feminism, various groups, and so we see some contradictions and conflicts among them, and some also close work. Kemalist feminists, they who were followers of Atatürk and recognized Atatürk as almost as a feminist politician and leader, were very keen on secularism and nationalism, which were also part of the Kemalist discourse. And they were in conflict in certain ways with the Islamist religious women, because they were particularly opposed. They opposed the headscarf, and with Kurdish women because they thought about the Kurdish nationalism as a threat to the national unity and integrity. And radical feminists had some issues with the LGBT plus groups because they never quite recognized trans women as a group that would be fully engaged in a feminist women rights oriented struggle. In the meantime, socialists collaborated both with Islamists and religious groups. That is, like they said, like women's attire is their own business. You cannot have politics based on women's body, and this is something that, and they also, as I mentioned earlier, work with the LGBT plus groups. An unusual alliance appeared, actually, collaboration with some religious feminists and LGBT groups. They associated with each other as being subject to the similar types of subjugation, they basically being the other way. And now, despite these differences and some conflicts among them, women managed to actually collaborate and join around certain issues, join in campaigns, lobbying, and public protest. And most importantly, in preparing shadow reports in the when Turkey became party to some international treaties. Now, achievements during this, or changes achieved during this period, the constitutional amendments for additions of stronger equality clauses and changes in the penal code. There's like some amendments about, again, toward more gender equality, and pressuring government to ratify international treaties such as CEDAW, UN's Women's Convention, or Convention for the Rights of the Child, but also using then these treaties to advance the rights further. Establishment of a cabinet post on women's affairs, direct and establishment of an office, Directorate of Women's Affairs, which would gather data, conduct analysis regarding gender gap and women's advancements, as well as working as a coordinator among various, again, government and state efforts toward women's equality. And various women's research and policy units throughout the state bureaucracy, including the ministries. A legislation of a brand new civil code, completely different civil code in 2001. And this code was highly egalitarian. It employed a gender-neutral language, spouse, as opposed to husband and wife. And so by default, the responsibilities would be shared. It had some limitations again, but this was a major achievement of the movement. And again, a brand new penal code was enacted in 2004. And this time the domestic and gender-based violence was recognized and criminalized. And also sexual offenses are defined as personal offenses, not offenses against public morality. And several laws addressing domestic violence were enacted. And during this reform period, the legislative body was busy also in producing various laws called European Union harmonization packages. And these packages involved extension of freedoms and recognition of minority rights. And these were inevitably important to women in general and for minority women, racial and ethnic minority women in particular. Now, these reforms were facilitated by certain things. Most importantly, Turkey's desire, as the political establishment's desire to be integrated into the international markets and to gain the political support of Western states, and most importantly, filing the official application to join the European Union. And I would call these also instrumentalism. Now, all of these achievements we listed were supported, the policy changes were followed by the male-dominant political establishment and governments, as well as legislators, to actually serve the Dislike as instruments toward achieving these goals. Nevertheless, that is, the women's groups and movements use these also as opportunities, these very actually the desires by the mainstream political establishment as opportunities and as leverage to press for more rights. So we see an interaction here. Now, the fourth period, this is the backlash reversal period, which roughly we can say started in 2012. We can take it actually backwards, maybe more to even 2007, but that's another issue. Now, this is a period of Justice and Development Party rule, but Justice and Development Party, known by the Turkish acronyms AKP, came to power in 2002 and has been ruling since then. We don't have a single AKP rule that is like we can think about actually a reformist AKP rule, the first 7 or 8 years, and then gradually becoming restrictive. And so a second portion of the AKP rule, and since 2015, we can say actually a one-person authoritarian rule in the person of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the AKP leader. So we can call this period as characterized as authoritarianism, Islamization of the entire state and the state apparatus and the country, as well as the policies, of course, and ultranationalism and militarism, Turkish nationalism and militarism. All of these, of course, have significant gendered impacts. And we can get into that maybe during the Q&A. Now, I have to open a parenthesis here that even during the reform period, when AKP continued with the reforms started in the late 1990s and early years of the millennium, had a dualistic gender approach. And on the one hand, it wanted to create some opportunities for women, but on the other hand, AKP always considered home and family as the main domain of women, and also subscribed to a male-led or upheld a male-led family structure. And even during the reform period, various pamphlets would be distributed by AKP-led municipalities, not by the national government, by the municipalities, about marriage and family life, telling the young couples, these would be distributed to the newlyweds, and telling the young couples about their proper function to be performed in the family as men and women, and reinforcing these were prescriptions of traditional family structure and gender norms. Second is in addition to dualistic position, perhaps as a part of it, although AKP supported the legislative reforms, it failed to implement them. And here we can see the result in some numbers. UN's Gender Development Index, based on gender equality or gaps in income, health, and education areas, you can see actually this changed over time. Well, we can roughly say AKP came to power at the end of 2002. So this might be a marker of we can see that the AKP policies impact. And the ranking, Gender Development Index ranking by the UN, goes from 1 through the higher, again, the numbers, 1 standing for the less inequality or more gender equality, and higher numbers would mean more gender inequality. And you can see that the AKP under this, there were some fluctuations. For some years, we don't even have the numbers, but in 2013, the score or ranking fell from 70s to 118 global ranking compared to other countries. And UN changed the formula and ranking, not formula, but the ranking. And so then from the numeric to just developing groups ranking from 1 to 5. First group is the most egalitarian, 5th group would be the least egalitarian, and Turkey took place in the 4th group and continue to be in that group since 2014. Now, changes in AKP approach we can see in discourse and policies. The starting in at least 2010, AKP officials and the leader started to assume a certain discourse, which I would say homophobic, pro-family, that would mean traditional gender roles really, and pro-natalist. Homosexuality is defined as an illness and danger to the family and society. Women are encouraged to have 3 to 5 children. Motherhood was cherished and career women were denounced, and gender and home-based work was promoted. Essentialism became actually an overt statement that in 2010, the then Prime Minister Erdogan actually said that men and women are not equal by nature. And he used the Arabic word fitrat, kind of stressing that this is according to Islam, not in so many words though. And reproductive rights of women were challenged. And again, Erdogan called abortion is murder. Now, regarding policy changes, the AKP government successively increased investment in religious education, increased the power and budget of the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which, by the way, is not an organization that recognizes and serves all religions. It is serving to the Muslim Sunnite population. It, as Professor Zehra mentioned, withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, dismantled and weakened state agencies that focus on women. The word women was taken out of the ministry that was responsible of women's affairs and family. Now we have only family there. And it started to open paths for religious marriages. We can talk about this in detail later. It's like ultimately, actually, if this would lead to a reinstitution of polygyny. And it also started through discourse and some draft bills that the facilitating and legitimizing child marriages, which could ultimately lead to legalization of child marriages, and reinstituting the practice of forcing girls and women to marry their rapists come back. And the attitude of the government has been always undermining child abuse, sexual violence, and gender-based violence instead of addressing them, again, despite some earlier legislation dismissive of the certain charges and so. And restricting women's right to divorce and restricting women's alimony rights. Now, as a response to these, that is, the women now had to be in a position of resisting change. Instead of calling for more change and advancement of women's rights, the resisting the attacks that come on hard-won rights one after another. And women established women's groups and organizations, established solidarity and collaboration, in addressing these issues as they appeared. And they tried to pressure the government, mobilize the support of the opposition parties, and increase public awareness on these issues. But then they came to the understanding that they cannot work on one issue at a time and be reactive to the assaults by the government. So a little over than a year ago, in August, well, this is the official date, of course, work predates that. On August 1st, women established a umbrella, I don't want to call it an organization, umbrella network to bring women's organizations that were collaborating earlier on issues to be more proactive and establish systemic work. And Eşitlik için Kadın Platformu, we can translate it as Women's Platform for Equality, includes more than 340 women's groups and organizations. Well, I should put in there just like LGBT women's, the groups as well, and over 150 supporting groups. Supporting groups are not a part of the network, but they do give support and join some of the campaigns. And even before the establishment of Eşik, but more so afterwards, women's feminists, I would say, that in Turkey started to establish collaborations with women in other countries. And for example, they sought collaboration with Eastern European countries regarding the Istanbul Convention, and more recently, globally, that is like the Eşik held meetings through, again, the webinar meetings, globally to address concerns and issues of Afghan women. Eşik also put out 5 urgent demands, and I'll go through them quickly. It's like using the language of the statement: stop constraining our equal citizenship rights, and the discourse and initiatives that threaten our hard-won rights, and develop and implement an action plan to ensure our right to live free from violence at home, at work, on the street, and in all public places. Reorganize education by following the principles of non-discrimination, scientific knowledge, and free access. That is like they make education free, and implement effective policies that would ensure equality in employment, access to daycare, freedom from sexual harassment and violence at work. Now, in order to have these 5 demands to put into action, they would, the women's organizations by themselves, also as Eşik, meet with political party leaders and members. And Eşik has a working group that monitors the parliament and parliamentary debates. It publishes reports and holds press releases, and so. Now, the most recent campaign of Eşik was launched actually this past Wednesday with a press conference, and it's going on now in social media. If you look at some Twitters and so, it's Instagrams, you can see that. And it has the motto of don't touch the laws, implement them. And this is actually in certain way telling of where the women's movement is and what the challenges are. The women at this point, although laws are not perfect and they have very limitations, they don't want to change those laws to improve them. On the contrary, the message says, don't touch them. With all of their imperfections, put them in force, implement them. And because the concern is that if there is an effort to improve the laws, if the laws come to the parliament's agenda, the AKP government and its ally, the nationalist, ultra-Turkish nationalist party, which have the two parties have the parliamentary majority, can subvert the desire for improvements that parliamentary debates and amendments to actually come up with more restrictions. So the motto is don't touch the laws. I can actually translate it that don't mess with the laws, implement them. Now, as for strategies, I can kind of quickly group them for you as for women among women's groups, they seek collective, collaborative, organized resistance and development of new action plans. And with government, since government stopped any kind of engagement with feminist organizations and women's groups that are not affiliated with the government, we can say, the women's organizations at this point gave up on working on the government and working with the government, but take the position of shaming and protesting. Political party works mainly is with the opposition parties, and women or Eşik and its components are willing to collaborate with the opposition political parties, but they still maintain a critical stance in dealing with them because they are not convinced that political parties are completely committed to the causes of women and gender equality. They want some change in the gender discourse and position of opposition parties as well. And with the women in other countries, they seek the development of venues of communication and exchange and act in solidarity. Now, I am a founding member of Eşik, so this is the disclosure, and I'm going to come up with a self-criticism in a way for the women's movement, and I am a part of which, and there is something that is not done by these activities or within these activities, although feminists, we would say, the feminist organizations and groups, some of them are within Eşik, gave up on the AKP government. We cannot have any pro-women change under AKP government. There is very little effort in the among the feminists actually, unless again they are engaged in some other organizations, and so to replace this government. There is discrediting going on, but not a forceful work toward an alternative. And another shortcoming is the not enough collaboration with other human rights, justice, and democracy-focused groups. The women's feminist campaigns seek their support for their own campaigns, but there is no collaborative effort to join and to come up with some joint campaigns. I'm afraid I took way too long, so thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arat. Indeed, feminist movement and women's organization have gained significant achievement in terms of advancing women's rights in Turkey through mobilization and struggle, though there is still a lot of work to do, especially given the challenge posed by the current authoritarian government. At this juncture, we will hear insights about the topic from two of our invited reactors. After the sharing of our reactors, we'll have a Q&A part. So make sure to type in your questions through our Q&A chat box, and we'll try our best to raise those questions to our guest speaker. But before anything else, please allow me to introduce our reactors. First, I would like to introduce Professor Lorna Hugh Israel. She teaches in the International Studies Department and is a faculty associate of Women and Gender Institute, both of which are based at Miriam College, Philippines. She's also the Vice President for Internal Affairs of the Philippine Middle East Studies Association. Our second reactor is Professor Caroline S. Sobrichea, currently serves as a professorial lecturer of the University of the Philippines Open University and chair of the CHED Technical Panel on Gender and Women's Studies. She's also a member of the Advisory Council of TESDA Women's Center and Vice President of the UP Center for Women's Studies Foundation. Let's all welcome the two of our reactors for this webinar. Maybe we can start with Professor Lorna Israel.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening to everyone, or good morning to others who are joining us from the other parts of the world. And thank you so much, Zehra, for that sharing, and very impressive, able to compress 100 years in 1 hour or so. And the first thing that I noticed from your presentation is that a lot of your struggles, points for contention, for debates, for actions are pretty much similar to what we're doing in the Philippines, for example, in the Asian region, for example, and we might say, the world over, because we tend, to be inspired, by each other's actions, or the ideas, and your presentation, I think, will give us a point for going back again, or to reviewing the history, or the journeys or struggles that we have undergone through time. And it's interesting to note that at the beginning of the engagement of the women in Turkey, it began with modernization, where in your presentation, as you said, there was a critique that it was virtually Westernization. In fact, as you were presenting, I was trying to look for where are the Turkish women here, because later on you will see from the world all over, we'll hear of educational reforms, fighting for the right to vote, which is the same, in all parts of the world at the time of modernization. And in the case of countries that have experienced colonialism or imperialism, especially after World War II, modernization project was really a contentious element or episode in our history in particular, because at the time now, countries like the Philippines or Turkey will have to prove to the world that, look, we are modern. Look, we have education, we go to school, we write, we read, and therefore we are modern. But at the same time, the present moment in particular under the Erdogan regime, is a reversal, as you said, but my feeling is that it's going back to that point where Turkey was being secularized under the guise of modernization. And I think we need to look at how during this modernization, what happened, the significant thing that happened was the so-called legal reforms, right? So you have, educational law, wages, etc. And I was wondering that after so many years, the legal reform is now being increasingly eroded because of the new policies or the reversal policies, which you might say conservative, restrictive. I'm not sure why it's not being called Islamist. Yeah. And going back to the family, my point is maybe because it was instrumentalist, it might not be rooted to the cultural psyche of Turkey. That's number one. But number two, we're talking here of to whom are these reforms were really beneficial. And as you said, it was basically at the forefront were middle-class women, educated women, the modern women, as you would say, were more or less familiar with the discourse, with the notion of equality, citizens' rights, etc. But at the same time, it forces us also to look. Well, I, was trying to look at it. Maybe there is something. The Erdogan regime is trying to say that, in this restrictive or conservative policies of mine, there might be some points here where we can consider elements of equality or gender equality. And because I was alerted to that notion because you said in passing that the men endorsed actually the legal reform or the modernization reform. That's why I was thinking in this 100 years of women's struggle in Turkey, there must be 100 years of men's resistance against it. But I don't believe that. There might be some men there who would become, advocates or supporters. That's why I'm kind of interested on the differences or the different strands of feminism that eventually emerged in Turkey. And as you said, they were different. They have diverging points, but they managed to work together. But in these two strands of feminism that we have presented, I'm quite interested on what feminist ideas or practice can we derive from the Kemalist feminism and from the Islamist feminism. And I think, and for me, that's important coming from outside of Turkey and someone who is a student of feminism and international studies, because it would give us more points, to reflect upon on how best to strategize our struggle. Number two, how best to conceive the kind of struggle or the kind of victory that we want to attain. And number three, the kind of women and men that we want to be when the so-called gender equality is put in place. And number four, maybe to prevent or minimize so-called reversal. Those are my only major points, Zehra. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Israel. Now I'd like to invite Professor Caroline Subrichea.
Okay. I am Dr. Subrichea. I look better with my picture. So let me just congratulate Dr. Sarah for a very, very comprehensive and exhaustive narrative about the history of the women's movement in your country. Listening to you is like listening to the story of my country because of the very many parallelism, as Lorna mentioned already, and all the tensions, all the efforts that you have done in order to advance the interest of women in your country. You talked about women and development, gender and development. You talk about the mechanisms for through legal means, no legislation, the active engagement of the civil service, civil society organizations, and of course, the very earnest effort you have done in network building. Lorna already identified some of the narratives that are very essential, no, in moving forward. But let me focus now on the CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because I have participated in this international meetings over the years, and over the years also in the ASEAN and the ASEAN system. I have participated in reviewing some of the reports of some countries. And the narrative you presented echoes the experience of most countries, especially now. In the last meeting of the CEDAW, there has been really a backlash, and the narrative that has been shared by many countries. I tried to read many of the reports because we have to give our comments on this report. Is really what we would call the fundamentalist backlash. This is happening in many ASEAN countries as well. It's happening in our country. My major concern really, and I would like maybe for you to respond, is to what extent are you able to use the CEDAW mechanism for the review? I read the reports that you submitted, and we know that by getting out of the Istanbul Convention, there would be sanctions. And this is the reason why we had the Geneva Conventions. So maybe my question really is, at this moment in time, you said network building, alliance building, but to what extent are you using the mechanisms provided by CEDAW? Because countries can provide sanctions, the sanctions that countries can give, especially because you want to join the United Nations, the European Union, and all that stuff. So that's my first very question, perhaps, that I would like to ask from you. And to what extent also, in the Geneva mechanism, CEDAW mechanism, we have really put in the participation of civil society organizations. In fact, there is a quota, and reports should be submitted by civil society organizations, and they are taken seriously because we established this primarily to engage governments. It is governments, fundamentalist, conservative governments, that try to erode the gains we have achieved in terms of promoting women's human rights. So maybe that's my first question. My second question is, my second question has to do with the civil society groups and the extent of negotiation that happened. There is tension on the base. We have an international convention too on the right to religion and culture. And in some of the meetings that I have attended, of course, there is tension between different. In our country, for instance, we have progressive Muslim groups and conservative Muslim groups. So this is just my second question, because maybe you can shed light and it will be very helpful for us. So thank you. Thank you for a very comprehensive and exhaustive presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sobrichea. Thank you, Professor Israel, for generously sharing perspectives and also experiences related to the topic discussed. Now we'll turn to Dr. Zehra Arat for the Q&A. So maybe we can hear first her comments about or answers to the questions of our reactors.
Well, thank you for the insightful comments. They're very rich, and I'm not sure if I can address all of them, but I'm going to touch upon a few things. And well, I will go back and forth, but this, like, first I would like to start with some of the comments that Lorna raised. Well, one important thing is, like, this is the importance of education regarding not only for, again, providing opportunities for women, but I think most important Kemalist reform was free education and establishment of village schools, and so which actually served in Turkey as a device of social mobilization. So and in that sense, actually, although the reforms were top down, through the educational process, and so we see a significant segment of the population actually who benefited from these opportunities also became reformers themselves. And the village schools were particularly important, and particularly also schools that were established for some regions to train teachers to go back to village schools, and so, and they're called village institutes. This was actually those schools were closed down soon after Turkey entered the multi-party era, and a party which was more conservative than the Republican People's Party that had the first, again, they ruled for almost 3 decades, that they closed it down. Then, so if they continue it, for example, I would think that some of these reforms would be better rooted in the society. Then these reforms rather started to more abstract. And the opportunities created, while I'm criticizing the reforms for their limitations, and so we have to acknowledge the positive impact as well. In the 1970s, for example, before we saw the impact of second wave feminism in Western countries, Turkey had proportionally more lawyers and doctors, female lawyers and doctors, than some Western states. They just liked, just like these Eastern Bloc countries were best in that, in terms of ranking, and would come Turkey. So the gains were largely, this is like again acquired, we can say, by the urban, middle, and upper class women, but not completely detached from again, this like the rural segments either. I am not sure that we can have we can learn from the Kemalist and Islamist agendas, but my learning will be basically this, like, that's why I am kind of stressing that reluctant or instrumentalist male approach. I really cannot call the at least within the Turkish practice, that is like the Kemalism as a feminism or an Islamist feminist by the AKP, even during the reform years, because they were more instrumentalists in that sense. However, as it is the case in all groups, and so some religious Muslims, including men and women, more women, I would say, and I would like to make a separate the distinction here. I don't call them Islamists because they're not trying to establish a Islamic rule and governance. They subscribe to secularism, but they're devout, and they in fact use Islamic principles to guide their own action. They are they establish allies with other feminist groups and organizations, and so we can rely upon or take their position as for our guidance. Well, yes, unfortunately, just like coming about, just like both of you, actually, both commentators talked about parallels with the Philippines. We can draw parallels from all around the world. And regarding Istanbul Convention, actually, we had a meeting, ISHIC holding a 3.5 hour long webinar that involved nearly 300 women from mostly from Europe, but from other parts of the world as well, to talk about Istanbul Convention. And we could see that what was happening in Poland, in Bulgaria, and so on, that is like very similar to the Turkish case. And so I am not, again, surprised in terms of those parallels. And for CEDAW, this is getting into Carolyn's comments, women were very concerned about, both in Turkey and actually it's like in these other countries that I mentioned, women are concerned that CEDAW, the Istanbul Convention, is just the beginning. CEDAW was useful, helpful. Women always used as a leverage to pressure the government. But next in Turkey may be CEDAW, withdrawal from CEDAW. But even without withdrawal, you can just actually make it not effective. And this actually takes us to the limitations of international instruments and when and how they can be practically left ineffective. Now, in order for these international mechanisms to be effective, they have to have some, those who enforce these mechanisms have to have some power over the government, some leverage over the government. And Turkish government today is completely defiant of any kind of, again, this international criticism. And I have to say here that not enough is coming anyway, because I'm starting with the European Union. They rely upon the AKP government to control the borders, the refugee problem. That is so Turkey has been instrumental in that for cutting the flow of the Syrian refugees to Europe, and now Afghanistan. So unfortunately, this is actually the ISHIC issued a criticism of the Council of Europe for accepting Turkey's withdrawal. Not again, legally, the council could have much, but just a very shallow protest. And so so that is what I want to say about CEDAW, and stressing the limitations of international mechanisms. And also we have to, since again, we have so many parallels with other countries, we have to be really concerned about Turkey's withdrawal from Istanbul Convention, because it can trigger similar acts in other parts of the world as well. Now, the civil society groups are, of course, come in different shape and color. And when I was making the presentation about the collaborations among different groups in Turkey, I also, again, was thinking about in the 1990s and the first decade of the new millennium, we could see more genuine collaboration of without necessarily subscribing to feminism, but with some concern about subjugation of women. Different groups could come together. But now the one outcome of the increased authoritarianism, the governing party in charge of the state not only dismantled and conquered the state agencies, but also can actually shape the civil society. There are women's organizations in favor of women's rights, but not very independent from the government. I mean, one of them is run by the daughter of the daughter of President Erdogan. So we did in Eşik, actually, we tried to reach them regarding Istanbul Convention. We tried to reach another conservative party, conservative, more I would call actually Islamist party, Saadet Party, women's affiliate, to work together. We hit a brick wall. Then they would follow the male leaders' language during our conversations. They would say that like Istanbul Convention is against family. Our laws are better. We can maintain women's rights and protect women's rights the way that they wouldn't get into an alliance with us. So I'm afraid I took too long, so I'll stop here. And if I left anything out, maybe during the Q&A, they will come out again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very, very enlightening. I can see the limitations, the border issues, the compromise that governments have to make, your government has to make. That's why it really limits your capacity to implement the provisions of the CEDAW Convention. Thank you very much.
Let me actually add one thing, because it is quite telling. It is when Taliban took over Kabul and the rest of the country, then we can say, the President Erdogan uttered something, and he said that Taliban is not far from our, when it comes to religion, Taliban is not far from us. And so this is a government that can endorse Taliban position and policies. And that's the kind of switch and shift that we see in the level in the government. So, and then Turkish government is engaged in Afghanistan with Taliban, hosted a Taliban delegation, and brought up this like the women's and minority rights. But that's just rhetoric, because minorities and women are repressed and their rights are being removed in Turkey. So I'm sorry, I just felt the urge to add that.
Right?
Thank you. Just one word. In the
Yes, ma'am.
ASEAN mechanism, that's why we always invoke the CEDAW. We can have sanctions. Perhaps you can think of sanctions, economic sanctions, like if they violate, like clitoridectomy infibulation was still practiced and there were some sanctions that were given, and economic sanctions. Maybe that is the only way by which governments who are abusive of women's human rights. That's the last word. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Sobrichea, and also Dr. Arat. There are several questions from our audience. So the first question is coming from Ralph Frondoza. Why is the instrumentation of women in the early years of the women's movement considered as a contributor in the struggle of the movement? That's the first question. Perfect. Yeah.
I'm sorry. It is a contributor in the sense that the women came to realize in a way that nothing will change until they are engaged, and nothing will change until they put the this is before the program started, when the panelists, we were talking about with each other. I just said that I see all issues as women's issues. So women could have this broader concern. Let's say socialist feminisms are concerned about class divisions and wrongs of capitalism. And but then they came to this understanding that we cannot just expect the emancipation of women and egalitarianism, gender equality, to be established by eliminating the private ownership of the means of production. We have to deal with patriarchy and act on it head on. I think it is like each time when we see, in fact, the earlier work of the second wave women's feminism was to deal with these limitations of the first reform era. But they were pushing the boundaries. They were pushing for more change, more progress. Now we came to a position of, we are not pushing for more change. We are just defending what we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question. How is colonialism a significant factor in how feminism develops in colonized countries, especially since modernization had been mentioned?
Well, I actually find colonialism, or any kind of external effort to improve women's condition and rights in a particular country, problematic. First of all, colonialism de facto would be instrumentalist in that. And the second is, even if there is genuine concern by some segments of the colonial power about the conditions of women in the dominated territories, because their engagement in the country is based on domination, is based on exploitation. Any positive message, any improvement that they would have a backlash, would have a resistance. And actually, I think that since the well, we are sometimes referred as post-colonial era, in many developing countries that experience direct foreign rule in the past, are still dealing with this association of feminism with Western powers, Western colonial intervention. And so in many places, women feel that it's just like, I'm not a feminist, but, and then would set their feminist agenda there, because feminism became this like effort not to be used. If you said you're feminist, you're then an instrument of colonialism or an instrument of Western intervention. So yeah, colonialism has never been good. And I have to say that in many ways that homophobia is introduced by colonialism to some places. There was much more tolerance and same-sex relations and so on, but criminalization came with colonial rule. And gendered education, tracking men and women differently, came with colonialism, because Western colonials believed in 19th century that exposing women to rigorous subjects like science, philosophy, and so on would disturb their reproductive cycle and abilities. So yes, they created some educational opportunities, but it was a mixed batch, and ultimately, I would say, not good for women. Net result. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from Mika. Wouldn't Turkey's economy suffer if women are not encouraged by the government to join the workforce and have a productive career? Also, regarding the policy that rapists can marry those that they had assaulted, as the government considered the economic and social development repercussions of this? I think she is asking for what would be your perspective about this particular issue.
Well, as for the economic consequences, the development concerns, well, this is the dualism of AKP. AKP doesn't say that women shouldn't work. Women should work in certain industries and, if possible, from home. And so women can contribute to economy. But this is also the second part of the shift in the discourse is pronatalism, discourse and policies. The women's contribution to economy is mainly seen in biological reproduction. The Erdogan first called young women, they call on young women to have 3 children. And then a couple of years later, he increased it to 5, because women's fertility, through women's fertility, the population would be expanded. And Erdogan's actually argument was economic. That is, we have to have a young workforce, which is ironic because unemployment among the young in Turkey is quite high. So he's not able to employ the young, but is going in that direction. And of course, again, this like the pushing women to marry their rapist, which is, well, it comes in this like 2 ways, like I just mentioned. I may need to open up. One of the changes that the AKP introduced was in the education system. And instead of the continuous education, that is the AKP, the continuous 8-year education, the AKP divided into 4-4-4. That is the so that would be after the first 4 years, student would not necessarily continue taking out of school and pushed into marriage. And this is in some conservative households, that has been the practice. So changing the educational system actually permits this kind of, again, arrangements. And regarding the, well, one of the part of the tradition, again, the either if you had an eye on a young girl as a man and kidnapped the woman, the girl, I will say girl, actually, usually they are not over 18 and so younger than, kidnap the girl and force yourself upon her. And now she is a spoiled product. And the so only way this is like the family honor can be protected is if the men marry the girl. And families go for that, and through the court they can increase the age of the girl, and or give this it's like if the girl is 15 or so, give the family parental consent. But if the girl is 10, they can actually force it, just like the mechanism, and they increase the age and have marriage, or they go for religious marriage. And by law, of course, all of these men are perpetrators. And when the, again, system works, that they are put in prison. Now, AKP has an agenda item in the parliament. It tries to actually release these, because these men sometimes put into prison after they have like 3 children with the women. And so they say that this is against family. These poor children and the women suffer because the head of the household is in the prison, cannot provide for them. So they are contemplating a kind of amnesty for these people. And this is what feminists concerned are, that this is going to open to a door for many other kind of, again, the abuses and child marriages, and again, allowing marrying to the rapists and so on.
Okay. So thank you very much. I wish we can all ask the questions raised by our attendees about this interesting discussion, but due to our limited time, perhaps the organizers can give the rest of the questions to Dr. Arat so that she can answer it offline. Okay. So at this point, we would like to present the certificate of appreciation to our distinguished speaker. Okay, so we would like to give the certificate of appreciation to our reactors for this webinar. We have the certificate of appreciation awarded to Professor Lorna Israel for serving as a reactor during the webinar, A Century of Struggle, Women's Movements and Rights in Turkey, held on 22nd of October 2021 via Zoom, given this 22nd day of October 2021, signed by the Dean of the Asian Center, Dr. Henelito Sevilla Jr. Same certificate goes to Dr. Caroline Sobrichea. Thank you very much for 2 of our reactors for sharing their perspectives and also their experience related to women's studies. Okay. And another certificate of appreciation will be awarded to Zehra Arat, for serving as the speaker during the webinar, A Century of Struggle, Women's Movements and Rights in Turkey, held on 22nd of October 2021 via Zoom, signed by Dr. Henelito A. Sevilla Jr., the Dean of the UP Asian Center. Thank you very much, Dr. Arat, for this wonderful presentation given to our guests, attendees. Okay. Hope we hear a lot from you, but we have limited time. But we really enjoyed your lecture, and you presented a lot of insights about the topic.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor Arat. We will continue communicating with you, and hopefully in the future, we could have you here in the Philippines.
That would be lovely. And I hope that you will also come to the US and this conversation will continue in person, as well as, again, perhaps online later on.
Professor, so when you come to the Philippines, you will speak before. May I invite you? I am the chair of the Commission on Higher Education for Gender, so you can 1,000 schools can listen to you. Very good.
Wonderful. That would be lovely.
Okay, thank you.
Can we have a group photo?
Yes, for souvenir.
Okay, so I'll take it. 1, 2, 3, smile.
Pahingi na lang yan, pahingi na lang.
Yes, ma'am. Again, 1, 2, 3, smile. All right.
Salamat.
Hey.
Salamat.
That ends our webinar tonight. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. May I request a copy of the chat and the Q&A, so
Yes.
I will know what kind of actually this like the feedback may have. But I really appreciate the comments, very insightful. And this is not just a tradition to say that this was a great experience. It has been a great experience, and I hope we'll continue our connections and conversations.